Hi, and welcome back to another episode of ADK Talks. I'm Jane, along with my co-host and brother Steve. Say hi, Steve.
Hi, Steve.
That was very chipper.
I tried.
You do try, and we try to bring you, listener, the best of the Adirondacks. Whether it's a place to eat, stay, shop, or something to experience, we're your guides to discovering the amazing things in New York State's 6 million acre Adirondack Park. Today, we're diving deep into the legacy of one of the park's most influential defenders, Paul Schaefer. Not to be confused with Paul Schaefer, David Letterman's former sidekick. Paul was an amazing advocate for the Adirondacks. And our guest is David Gibson, author of A Force for Nature, Paul Schaefer's Adirondack Coalitions. In this episode, we'll explore how Schaefer built powerful alliances to protect the wilderness, why his vision still matters today, and what lessons we can carry forward. Whether you're listening from a camp chair by a mountain lake or a subway seat miles away, get ready for a conversation about one man's extraordinary passion, the alliances he formed that made history, and the future of the park that we all love. David, welcome to the ADK Talks podcast.
Thank you so much, Jane and Steve.
Welcome. Thank you.
So for those who might be unfamiliar with your work, can you tell us a bit about your background and your journey to becoming such a passionate advocate for the park?
Well, like many in the Adirondacks, I went to summer camp, not in the Adirondacks, but in Maine. And part of my life was in New York City, and the other part was in Maine. And because my grandmother owned a house there on the Kennebec River.
Okay.
And and I was privileged enough to be sent to summer camp in central Maine, where we took a number of trips all over the state, canoeing trips, hiking trips. And so that's where I got my orientation. I also love camping out outside my grandmother's house in the woods. And so that's where I really gained an appreciation for the wilderness, the wilder qualities of our outdoors, and how one can feel in that kind of wild environment. And it excited me. And so that's where it all began, I think.
That's lovely. Maine is lovely. Not as lovely as the Adirondacks, but we're a little bit biased. So how did you come to know Paul Schaefer? Was it personal, professional, through your research?
I moved with Susan to a house here in Ballston Lake, New York in the mid-'80s, 1980s. And I found a job with the state temporarily with environmental education. That was my interest, with the DEC Five Rivers Environmental Education Center. And eventually they said that, well, this job is running out. You might want to apply to our friend we know up that works for the State Office of Parks in Saratoga. And so I did apply and got that job. And I worked at Saratoga Spa State Park for the regional office in Saratoga. And my 2 or 3 years into that job, became a friend, joined the staff as well. And we put on a slide lecture series called Views of the North Country. And one of the people that was recommended to us was Paul Schaefer. And it turns out that Paul couldn't come that night. He sent an associate, as he called him, to show the film, The Adirondack, The Land Nobody Knows, which is one of the early 1980, a color documentary about the preservation work to protect the Adirondacks. So I didn't meet him then. But then next thing I knew, the park manager, who was also a close friend, Tom Cobb, put a job description on my desk, said, you might want to apply for this one. And it was work for the Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks. And I learned that this group had formed in 1901 and was looking for an executive director. So I wrote my cover letter and sent in my resume. And next thing you know, I was invited for an interview and with 3 trustees of the organization, and interviewed, I guess, successfully, because in late December, I got the thin envelope that said, you are now our executive director.
Oh, wow.
So good luck. And right about that time, or the end of between Christmas and New Year's, I was invited to one of the trustees' homes for a potluck dinner, just to welcome me. And amongst those guests was Paul Schaefer. That's when I really met him.
Okay.
And Paul, I learned very quickly, had been a vice president of the Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks for 40 years at that time.
Wow.
By that time, 40 years. Goes back to the 40s. And this was 1987. So that's where I met him. And the next thing I knew, I was visiting him at his house on 897 St. David's Lane and soaking up what it is like to be with Paul Schaefer.
Well, tell us a little bit about that. What was he like personally? Can you describe him for us?
Well, he was a very, very single-minded individual in terms of protecting the Adirondacks. Article 14, Section 1, the Forever Wild Clause that protects the Adirondack and Catskill Forest Preserve was a Bible for him, a direction, a true north pointing. And he believed in it in his heart. As a young man, he came to know it. And by the time I knew him in his late 70s, he was the elder statesman for Article 14. And he was the successor in a long chain of people that stretched back to the 19th century.
Right.
Who assumed that. And Paul was just the latest iteration, but someone who was extremely able to pick people out of a lineup and say, you're the key person I need right now to help me with this particular protection project or this educational project. Because he was an educator as much as he was an advocate. He was a filmmaker. He wrote. He never graduated from high school, but he was an expert writer.
Wow.
And he took up film because his mentor took up film before him and showed him how to do it and to make films to show what is at stake. If you don't protect this area, this was going to happen. And so he was that kind of person, very much an individual that attracted other people to him and made you feel like you were the key player in whatever was happening at the moment.
Wow. Sounds like he was just an extremely talented storyteller too. That's amazing.
Yes, he was. He was a very good storyteller. And many of those stories were key to, those he recruited in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. He died in 1996.
What do you think drove his passion? What made him, what experiences or what made him so become such a big advocate for the Adirondacks?
It's hard to know, but it's happened early in his life too. I mean, as I say in my book, at age 6 or 5, he was already exploring. And this was a time, he was born in 1908. This was a time when his parents were eager for their 5 children to be outside, out of the house and on their own. And so he became an explorer at a very early age. Yes, he was frightened by some of the things he found.
Right.
As he says, I went to an old house. And again, there was very little development where they grew up in Rotterdam. But I went to a house and it was a haunted house. And I steeled myself and explored all through that house and scared myself silly. But it was part of my early interest in outdoor exploration. So it came from an early age. It was encouraged by his parents. All of his siblings took part. His 2 brothers and his 2 sisters were all outdoor people. And his mother had a fragile constitution in terms of her lungs and needed to get out of Rotterdam, Schenectady on doctor's orders. She took the cure in Raybrook for pneumonia and asthma. And eventually her brother found a place in Baker's Mills, New York, in northern Warren County that they could rent. And the only way they could rent there was to rely on local people to supply them with milk, eggs, rutabagas, and all sorts of jellies and jams, fruit. These people were at the end of the agricultural history on this mountainside that had been there since white people had come to that country. And so they grew all sorts of things in very tough conditions. But they welcomed the Schaefers and supplied them, and that enabled them to spend every summer during the early 1920s, 100 years ago. Well supplied, well fed. And from there, Paul learned to hunt and fish and supply his family with food. And it went on from there.
Wow. Those experiences, you think, compel him to become a conservationist and drive his passion for preserving the park.
Well, of course, because he was such a good outdoors person, the locals not only helped him and his family, but they relied on him to go packing into the wilderness with them.
Oh, wow.
And it wasn't state wilderness at the time, but it was what became the Siamese Ponds Wilderness. And these are hunting trips. And again, these people and local people relied on things they hunted, on white-tailed deer, woodchucks. And Paul was an eager learner. And he went with them, learned a lot about the outdoors and survival with them, and he had a good sense of humor, but he gained a lot of insight about how to get along with people on these trips. Sometimes they were just a day, sometimes several nights. And he learned how to camp outdoors with them. And so that gave him the confidence as an outdoors person. What gave him the impetus to conserve the outdoors, I think, was as he matured, he met John Apperson in Schenectady, New York. And Apperson was highly aware of threats to Lake George and things that were going on throughout the Adirondacks, overlogging, overdevelopment, and many, many other threats to the Constitution itself, the Article 14, the Forever Wild Clause, that were under attack by commercial and industrial interests, moneyed interests. And so he learned when he met Apperson, it was 1931. By that time, he had been part of the Mohawk Valley Hiking Club, which also greatly expanded his range of interests in terms of exploration. And so he visited many farms, he met Indians who used the Adirondacks. He met all sorts of people on these hikes. And he also met his future wife there. These were young people that met each other, as many do today, through outdoor adventure together, hiking clubs. And the Mohawk Valley Hiking Club was a very influential group, as it turned out. So he and Carolyn met and married in 1934. But in 1931, he met John Apperson, and Apperson said, "Can you help me recruit by distribution these flyers that were going to oppose a constitutional amendment to the Forever Wild Clause?" And that's how he got involved, and he began to learn from Apperson what the threats were and what he could do about them. So that was a very key relationship.
That's so, interesting. Think about, what's going on in some of the national parks right now. And we're so lucky and fortunate that is part of our Constitution in New York State. But could people still challenge that again or amend it? There could be amendments to reverse some of the policies that protect the land. And then we always have to be vigilant.
Yes, there are many amendments. So those are small, relatively small in scale. Not the Northway. That was a big one.
Right.
Which took 400 acres of state land. But in general, the amendments since 1895 have been small scale, small in acreage. And so and many of the public have rejected it as well. Yeah. So as you say, Jane, it's the people that decide fundamentally whether the lands of the state will be forever kept as wild forest lands into the future.
What inspired you to write A Force for Nature?
I often say I worked for Paul. I didn't. I worked for all of the trustees of the Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks. He was one of the most influential, but not the only one. This was a group largely of men. There are only 2 women who joined my board in the 1980s into the 90s. One of them was Barbara McMartin, a very, very influential writer, and she was a force for nature. So I had some very interesting, forceful, opinionated, but also well-informed people on my board. And I was very lucky to meet them all. And as time went on, I spent less time with Paul as is when I knew him for 10 years. But by my eighth and ninth year, I was busy, doing all the things an executive director has to do for a nonprofit organization. So I saw less of him. Fortunately, I had met a friend of his, Paul Schaefer, another young friend who was between jobs. Like many people, this person worked for the General Electric Company. And whole force for nature comes from the employees and retirees of GE. But Ken was between jobs, and I met him and at Paul's house. And Paul says, "This is a fellow you want to get to know, and he should join the board of trustees." And oftentimes I would be sitting with Paul Schaefer, and he would say, "Do you know this person? He should be on the board. Get the nominating committee chairman on the phone now." And Ken was one of those. And Ken joined the board because Paul wanted him and nominated him. And Ken began to recruit new members for the association. In fact, he went to his first meeting with 10 new members that he had recruited.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
And that thoroughly embarrassed other members of the board. And then during that time, in between jobs, Ken would visit Paul Schaefer and tape him, and got to know Paul very well. And they would sit together for long hours and Ken would have the tape running. And I often talked with Paul too, as you know, for 10 years. But I didn't bring my tape recorder, and I always felt embarrassed about taping him because he didn't like it. But he grew comfortable with Ken, allowed it. And those tapes, when I heard them, it was like me talking with Paul again.
Wow.
But these were exact words. I would go home and put my words, my memories of meeting Paul and the stories he would tell onto my own tape recorder. But of course, you forget things immediately.
Right.
Unless you're taping them at the time. And so I listened to those 10 or 12 CDs that Ken had mastered, had professionally mastered, so the noise came out. And man, that just lit a fire under my project. I said, I knew I had to write this book. And so that was key. And Ken has been working for Adirondack Wild Friends of the Forest Preserve, my nonprofit organization, ever since. He worked for the association and then now with Adirondack Wild. So he's become a close friend and colleague.
That's great. That's wonderful that you had access to those tapes. That's fantastic. Give our listeners an overview of the book. What are some of the key themes and the stories you felt most compelled to include?
Well, I wanted to introduce Paul Schaefer and his influence. He very rarely left the state of New York. He wasn't a widely traveled man.
Mm-hmm.
He went to Washington, D.C. several times to testify. He went to his children's graduations out of state. A remarkable family. Other than that, he stayed in New York, and there's one reason. He says they might do something to Article 14 while I'm away.
And,
wow. That would, yeah. And he felt that way, and in many ways, he was right. In the 1940s, and certainly in the 1950s, Paul became highly sought after as a touchstone for whether or not something would be constitutionally permissible in the Forest Preserve, which is our state lands in the Adirondacks and Catskills. And so I wanted to capture that importance early on in the early chapters, just to give an overview. And also the fact that during this time, Paul met Howard Zahniser, and he knew Bob Marshall, the founder of the Wilderness Society.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew his brother George. And when Bob died, George and Paul became very, very close allies. So Paul knew what was going on nationally in the early nascent wilderness movement across the country, and was hooked right into it.
Wow. And
so people came to him for advice about what was going on in New York and the Forest Preserve, and vice versa. And so that's what I introduce as Paul's influence, not only in New York, but his influence nationally. And I wanted to give people a quick sense of that. And then I get into why, as you say, why did he get interested in protecting the wilderness environment? And so I get into his upbringing and his early experiences hunting and fishing and guiding in Baker's Mills and in the Siamese Ponds Wilderness. And his mentors like John Apperson, his friendship with Howard Sonnheiser, his family, and he was a home builder. So I wanted to talk about his home building. He built hundreds of beautiful homes because he was interested in architecture and also in how things fit together physically. And so he was an expert at building homes with frame homes, but with old chestnut. And he tore down old Dutch barns that were being torn down. He would borrow that lumber, take that lumber and reconstruct homes with it.
Wow.
And he'd always have a slate roof and a wooden lintel of the door. And there were signatures of a Paul Schaefer home. So I wanted to talk about that and say, look, this was a developer, as we call them today, but someone who is exquisitely sensitive to how a house was built and where it was built. So siting and designing a home was very key to him. And he told me one time that he considers the origins of all of this knowledge, he believes, came from someone in his roots, in his past, that built a cathedral. And he believed that very firmly. And so that's very possible. But then the book then transitions from his designing with nature and designing his homes to the battles he fought for the forest preserve. And he saw the two things as very, very complementary, designing beautiful built environments and protecting the wilder environment beyond them. And so I have 6 or 7 or 8 chapters about the key moments in the 20th century that he helped save Article 14 and apply it to preserve wild rivers that were under threat from huge dams, both in the southwestern Adirondacks and on the upper Hudson. Many people don't know that the upper Hudson would have had 5 major dams above Luzerne.
Wow.
That would have utterly changed our experience with the river. It would have been lost forever. There would have been a lot of large lakes and motorboats, but the river would be lost. And so he was key to that moment of preserving the upper Hudson. And of course, the internal combustion engine. What was going to Article 14 said that the lands of the state shall be forever kept as wild forest. What does that say about our automobiles, our Jeeps, our ATVs, and 1,000 other contraptions that we would just as soon drive down a trail to reach our pond, our favorite place? And so that hit right in the mid 20th century, and Paul Schaefer had to address that. And he did very forcefully. And he also, politics was much more personal then. In other words, the Speaker of the Assembly, of the New York State Assembly, happened to live on his street. And, well, that's interesting. I have a state senator who lives near me. Do I ever visit that state senator? No, I do not. But in 1945, when Paul knew he had a Speaker of the Assembly living down his street, he dropped by. And they got to personally know each other.
Wow.
And that relationship was very critical in saving the Moose River Plains from a series of huge dams that were going to be used for hydropower, which are now the Moose River Plains Wild Forest and the West Canada Lakes Wilderness. So I just want to point out those things, that he took advantage of every opportunity he was given, and he seized them as well. But as I say, when he knew he had a Speaker of the Assembly living near him, he took advantage. And he was named a volunteer. He never got paid for this work. He was named a volunteer secretary for a committee that the Speaker set up to examine hydro dams across the state of New York, particularly in the Adirondacks. What would be the impact on the wild rivers and scenic rivers of the Adirondacks if the Army Corps of Engineers and the State of New York Water Power and Control Commission had succeeded in building 38 major dams on Adirondack rivers, which are now in the wild, scenic, and recreational river system? Well, they wouldn't be if those dams had been built.
What surprised you the most in your research about Paul and his legacy?
I remember driving him because he had in his later in his 80s he really shouldn't have driven, because he had macular degeneration.
Right.
And so whether it was me or others my age that would drive him to these meetings, he was appointed to all these committees
Wow.
concerning the Adirondacks. And so we often drove him and sat in on the meetings. And it was during those drives up the Northway that we would learn so many interesting things, and just be amazed at the number of places where he influenced Adirondack history.
Mm.
And I think in terms of surprise, every time I drove with him was a surprise. There was a surprise.
You just get the sense that he was almost born to have this role and to do all these things. It was both the passion and also having the capability, as you said, to connect people, to tell these stories. It's really an incredible history. It's great.
Yeah, he had a lot of self-confidence, obviously, and had no hesitation to recruit others, no matter where you came from. It didn't matter whether you were urban, rural. If you had an interest, if you were hunting with him, he had a hunting party that is now the Siamese Ponds Wilderness, and they hunted for days and weeks into that country. Rugged.
Wow.
They went in by horse and wagon, and he got to know those men very, very well. And if it's just one of those had an interest in what he was saying in the tent, 3 miles in, one of them had an interest in why he was saving the Upper Hudson or the Moose River Plains. He would climb onto them, and they would be part of this many coalitions that he established, who were also hunters and fishers. And they had no knowledge that they would become environmentalists, but a few of those hunters and fishers did join. One of them was also a car salesman who was a hunter. He enjoyed whitetail deer. He enjoyed learning about whitetail deer, enjoyed hunting whitetail deer. And he was outraged that some of these dams would flood out their winter habitat. And he became a key person in the coalitions that Schaefer created. The Adirondack Mountain Club. Paul was a member of the Adirondack Mountain Club at a young age, which had just been founded in the early 1920s. And so members of the Adirondack Mountain Club were key to the coalitions he created.
You use that word coalitions, and it's in your title. What did you really mean by that? And
well, it's Jane. It's the people came into his orbit from various walks of life.
Okay.
And most of them were not environmentally inclined. They were interested in his hunting and fishing stories, for example, but they had no idea where that might lead and lead them. Some of them were members of the fish and game clubs. And there were so many fish and game clubs as they are today, but just starting up 100 years ago. And by the mid-century, these were active people who Paul would go out and actively speak at their meetings about whatever threat he perceived or saw in the distance, or right then, at that time. And so these were part of the coalition. Hunters, fishers were appalled by the big dams that were being planned without their consent. And New York State had amended Article 14 early in the 20th century to allow these dams. You couldn't build your house on the forest preserve, but you could dam the forest preserve for hydropower to regulate the river. And you could take a certain percentage of the forest preserve for that purpose. And many of these people who hunted, fished, but also garden club members were outraged. Who was consulting them about this right that had been approved in the early 20th century, but was now mid 20th century? They wanted to give their consent. And union members were part of the coalition, electrical workers, steam fitters. Paul Schaefer met Howard Zahniser of the Wilderness Society, and they were close friends and allies. And when he learned, Paul called him up one day in Washington, D.C., where Zahniser was the executive director of the Wilderness Society, and said, "Who do you know in the labor union movement?" And Howard said, I know just the right person for you to get to know. And he was director of the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations.
Mm. And
he was also loved the outdoors, this individual. And they started to correspond. And before you know it, the Moose River Plains, the fight over the Moose River Plains to block those dams was joined by ordinary labor unions.
Wow.
And their employers were for the dams because that meant money in their pockets. Construction work, big construction work. But they found pretty quickly after a few years that their laborers, their workers, were not in favor and were organizing against them. So that was part of the coalition too. So it was a lot of different people from different walks of life, and Schaefer was right in the middle of it.
Wow. It's what we would call nowadays a connector. Is somebody who's just very good at seeking out the right connections and also connecting people together. That's amazing.
Yeah. And Schaefer would use those connections with the governors of New York and their staff very effectively. So that the staff, the commissioners that was working for the governors at that time, knew that if there was something controversial, not only Schaefer would be in touch with them, but people that were similarly outraged that Schaefer had recruited would be contacting them.
Wow. Such an influential person and who did just tremendous work. How is his legacy being carried on today? And how can we show our respect and appreciation for it?
Well, I think we are without necessarily knowing it.
Right.
I mean, the Adirondack Park Agency, the Department of Environmental Conservation, and others in the state know that there's a huge constituency for the Adirondacks. And some of that constituency, a good part of it, was reinforced by people like Paul Schaefer in the 20th century. So in the 21st century, we're living off that bank, if you will.
Yeah.
That bank of assets that Schaefer and people his age had created for us from their predecessors. So we are links in a chain. And that's what I'd like to say. And so people my age obviously need to do the same recruiting in as many ways as we can as Paul Schaefer did. People younger than us.
Right.
To carry that on. And I think, given the climate crisis that we're in, it's very necessary. And when I meet young people, and as I try to do in my own, I find them very interested in the history that they are now a part of. And I want to make them feel a part of that history.
Can you talk, and we can probably talk about Paul Schaefer all day. I want to also make sure, though, that we talk about your work with Adirondack Wild, Friends of the Forest Preserve. Can you tell us a little bit about that organization and why it was created and what they do?
Paul Schaefer created Friends of the Forest Preserve in 1945.
Okay.
As an umbrella under which many people from different backgrounds could become interested and join the movement to protect the forest preserve and to expand the forest preserve to its current nearly 3 million acreage. So this is 80 years later.
Wow.
This year is our 80th anniversary. We added the word Adirondack Wild in 2010. A group of us had left the Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks for various reasons. And we had renovated Paul Schaefer's and his family's home to be our headquarters. Union College now runs that. He's the Kelly Adirondack Center. But a bunch of us who came from the association realized that we had a chance to resurrect Paul's organization from 1945. And we added Adirondack Wild to it to make it more clear about what we were doing. We're devoted to the wilderness, the wilder lands of the Adirondacks, public and private, and those interconnections between them, so that you fly over the Adirondacks and you wonder, is that public land or private? I can't really tell. And that's the seamless quality. And that's what we're trying to make sure is preserved far into the future, because it is that very continuity of lands and contiguous nature that is the best buffer against climate change, among many other things, and also for wildlife in the park to be able to move between habitats. And that's our mission, really, is the continuity, the integrity of the Adirondack Park landscape, the wilder part of that landscape. And also to hold, because we think that's a responsibility for the state as well, to hold government agencies accountable for their responsibilities to protect the Adirondack Park, DEC, APA, among them, governor's office, state legislators. And we don't work alone. We're part of a large coalition with the Adirondack Mountain Club, the Adirondack Council, Adirondack Wilderness Advocates, Protect the Adirondacks. And we often meet with the Adirondack Nature Conservancy and Land Trust because they are so important in what they have been doing. As you say, the Lake George the Land Conservancy has been critical in this whole movement. So we got to work together, and we don't work alone, and that's key.
That's great. I mean, from somebody who we've had Lake George Land Conservancy on, we just had the Adirondack Council on. I often get overwhelmed with, all the different organizations, and part of me is like, are these people talking to each other? Are they in touch? Is any of this redundant? But it's great to hear about work that Adirondack Wild is doing to help be part of creating a coalition, and being part of it and maintaining it is so important. Listener, if you want more information about Adirondack Wild, their website is adirondackwild.org. You can read all about the great work that they're doing. And there's quite a bit on there too about who Paul Schaefer was as well. So definitely check that out. Okay, so thank you for that. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
From your perspective, what are the biggest challenges facing the park now? You mentioned climate change. That's obviously a big one.
Yeah, I think it's making sure the Adirondacks have a strong voice in the very difficult challenges facing the state of New York as a whole.
Right.
And the region we live in, the Northeast. And so as important as the Adirondack Park is, and it has a national level importance, if not international level importance, that can be quickly forgotten in a crisis. And so I think in the Albany, we're facing one now with all the budget cuts that the federal government has imposed on not only this state, but many others. So I think that making sure that the Adirondacks, its housing needs and many other needs are addressed, and that we pay attention and listen to closely local government whenever possible and to listen to their issues and have an honest dialogue with them. So that's key. I say the climate crisis is the overarching issue that we face, but that really is also a crisis of attention span. Yeah. And so the water quality of the Adirondacks, of course, gets a lot of attention. But in the state as a whole, not enough attention. So that's our collective job, to remind people that that the Adirondack Park is of national stature. And what goes on here gets the attention of people here in the country and in the world. Some years ago, I was part of a coalition, part of a effort to bring international environmentalists and cultural artists from Russia, from Mongolia, from other parts of the world to the Adirondacks. That's no longer possible, given what has happened to Russia. Those people can no longer come here. But they were intensely interested in what was achieved under Article 14 and our environmental laws here in New York State. So the potential for New York State to influence what's going on around the world is very profound.
I hadn't thought of it like that. That's a really great point. If Paul were alive today, David, what advice do you think he'd give to the next generation of Adirondack advocates?
Keep it up. And he would say that, we have more money now to protect land than ever was the case in his lifetime.
Wow.
And so there's no lack of state resources through the Environmental Protection Fund, which is this dedicated source of revenue that he was eager for most of his life, never achieved until 3 years before he died in 1993. But and we have a bond act And we need state agencies working together to make these open space protection projects a higher priority, because every time you connect pieces of land together, and that doesn't mean people can't use the land in various ways through a conservation easement. The point is not to convert that land forever into housing or into roads or into malls or into industrial complexes. The conversion of that land is what breaks it up, and that fragments the landscape and makes it much more vulnerable to the changing climate. So he would say, he would look around and understand climate change as a huge threat. And he would say, keep up the work and redouble your efforts to add another 1 million acres of protected land in the Adirondacks and throughout the state.
Wow. We talk about this, and we probably mention this in almost every episode, but, I don't think people truly appreciate how big the Adirondacks are. It's 6 million acres, as we say in our opening, but I mean, that's bigger than the state of New Jersey. So, it takes a lot of attention and care to maintain the beauty and the wilderness that's here. And it really is a great reminder we all need to be vigilant. So
yeah, vigilant and a good steward, and understand, and to be able to understand what it takes to be a good steward and to support each other.
Yeah.
And there are many, many fine people working in the state of New York who are handicapped in terms of their ability to do what they believe is right.
Right.
For a variety of reasons. But to find a time to talk with them and to work with them and to support them. And I'm a member of the Forest Preserve Advisory Committee of the DEC. It's been around since 1980. It's never been more important in terms of being able not only to present my advocacy for something, but also to listen closely to what the department and others are saying about what their needs are, and budgetary and other needs.
Yeah.
So the need to be closely allied wherever possible and to realize that we're all in this together is very key.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
One of the many things, actually, that strike me about Paul's story is, he accomplished all these amazing things in helping to protect the Adirondacks, but it was also the way he went about it and how he brought people together. And in a time right now in this country where it's so divided, I think he's also a great part of his legacy is his example of working together. Did he come by that naturally? I mean, can you describe for me how you think he united people?
Well, I think you have to be self-confident to walk into a situation where someone else is coming from a very different world or cultural world or employment world or whatever world they may live in, what they may look like. So, and to present yourself and to try to enlist their support is not something that comes naturally to many of us. And I think Paul had a very innate sense of ability to do that. And when he felt he had a cause, he thought they had great potential. As one of his great friends said, you always felt that you were the key player. And when you feel that way, suddenly you can do things that you didn't think you were capable of.
Right.
And or think about doing them. And Schaefer would prod you and sometimes correct you. But I think that was one thing, is great self-confidence that she developed. And when he learned about his own capabilities, and of course he had to build homes. He had to engage with buyers of those homes. And he had to oversee a foreman and others who were constructing those homes and oversee their work. And so he got to know people and size them up very, very well.
Somebody once said to me, people who are truly confident make other people feel good. And I think confidence is sometimes misinterpreted as, being bold and outspoken.
Yeah, or boastful. He was never boastful. No, Paul was never that way. And he always wanted to give credit to others.
Yeah.
And I think I present that in the book as much as I can.
Yeah, definitely. And is something you said earlier too, that the skill of listening to people and understanding what they're all about, and then being able to make that connection to your particular agendas is also a sign of a really good leader. So that's amazing.
Yeah, and Howard Zahniser, the secretary of the Wilderness Society, when he went hiking with Paul in the high peaks, they had those moments on a lean-to above Lake Colden and the floodlands that Howard saw something in Paul too, and realized that if he could, I don't know, just by osmosis, absorb some of Paul Schaefer, he could do this nationally. He could take Article 14 and not in the Constitution, but in federal law, he could create a national wilderness system. And so that idea took root, germinated in the High Peaks Wilderness of the Adirondacks on several nights alone together. And so that was key to the 1964 Wilderness Act.
This has been, I've learned so much from our conversation today, Dave. Thank you so much. But before we release you back into the wild, we end every episode of our podcast by asking our guests to tell us about their favorite place in the Adirondacks. And it can be anything. It can certainly be a paddle or a hike or a view, a camping spot. It can also be, an ice cream stand, your favorite restaurant or bar, or a gallery, or anything. We like to sort of position it as, if you had a friend coming to the Adirondacks for the first time, what would you tell them to do? Or we say, oh, you've got to stop here. What might that place be? And you can name more than one. Our guests often have a hard time with this question because they have like 10 things they want to say, but what would you share?
Well, part of me is, of course, part of my heart is in where Paul Schaefer settled in the Adirondacks in Baker's Mills, and I go there as much as I can. And so that country and just wandering around the eastern Siamese Ponds Wilderness, where Schaefer hunted, is very rugged. And you always bring a map and compass with you. Don't get overconfident there. But it's beautiful country. And every time I come out of that country, I feel more alive. But so that's one place, the Siamese Ponds Wilderness, which is, I don't go in there for overnights anymore, but really, really learned a lot about myself there. And also on a trail, I am an admirer of the late Mike Story, who was the naturalist for the Adirondack Park Agency when I began my job. And Mike is an extraordinary man who has written many books about the Adirondacks, natural history. And he was very skilled at laying out trails. And one of the trails he laid out was for the Newcomb Visitor Interpretive Center. And the Peninsula Trail is one of those trails that he designed, and you've probably been on it, the way where it leads you and the vistas it leads you to. And it's just one of the great trails of the Adirondacks. For anyone who coming to the Adirondacks for the first time, I would say go there.
Wow. Cool. That's great. Before we wrap up, where can our listeners find your book?
Obviously, you can find it on Amazon, Jane. You can find it at Syracuse University Press website under new listings. You can find it at Lake Placid bookstore. You can find it in Schenectady bookstores like the Open Door.
Yeah.
And other bookstores in Saratoga Springs. And I'm just learning about where my books might be.
So funny. That's great.
The best, obviously, I always try to direct them to the publisher books, which is Syracuse University Press.
Okay. Listener, we'll have links for all of that in our show notes. So if you're interested in picking up that book, we always love to support our local independent bookstores, but getting it directly from the publisher is a great thing too. Dave, thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you, Jane.
It's been a really great experience and learned a lot. And I think we'll need to put your book on our Christmas book list.
Great.
So thank you very much, Dave.
It was my pleasure, Jane and Steve. It was wonderful talking with you.
Yes, it was great.
Wow, that is such an amazing story. I mean, the book really is very inspirational, and Paul, what an amazing legacy.
I really don't think people understand what it's taken to keep the Adirondacks the way they are.
Yeah. Yep.
And I don't want to say sacrificing, because I don't think he was sacrificing anything. He was doing it out of love. And that I'm glad I was about to ask about all the dam projects, because I hadn't realized how many were going to be affecting the Hudson.
Wow.
And what the extent that it would have just flooded thousands and thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres, and it's just it's amazing, because you talk about the groups you brought together, and oftentimes you'd think of a hunting club as being politically conservative, not necessarily environmentally conservative. But when they were going to lose their land that they were hunting on, they recognized that it what might have been looked at something more politically opposite of some of their thoughts or feelings, that it was to their advantage and their interest to promote conservation. And conservation is a word that isn't that far from conservative.
Yeah. I mean, it's just so interesting to me, and we've been coming up here for 40 years. And, just in doing this podcast, what different perspective and I have on so many things in the Adirondacks. And I think a hunting and fishing club, I have a stereotype, but they're stewards of the land and good stewards of the land.
Yeah.
And, again, and I don't want to harp on this point, but one part of Paul Schaefer's legacy that really sticks with me is bringing people together, people who you wouldn't expect to be working together, all for the same cause. They might not have the same perspective on it, but they all understand the value of preserving this land and making sure that we're being good stewards of it. So it was great.
They all had a common interest.
Yeah. Or he could find a way to connect people through some kind of interest. Exactly. Yeah. All right. I think that's all we have time for today. Listener, thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. It helps others not only find our show, but also get more information and more insights on the best things to do and places to visit in the Adirondacks. For more exclusive Adirondack content and local insights, visit our website, adktaste.com, and be sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter so you never miss an update. So until next time, keep exploring and experiencing the fabulous Adirondacks.
Enjoy. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.